Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm so glad to see that so many of you have stayed with us for the 4 sessions. We know that they're valuable to you, and I'm glad that you're here today. We're going to turn it over to Dr. Kristen Ashare, who is the director of the Office of Postdoctoral Scholars, who is at UB with lots and lots of knowledge about broader impact, and she's going to talk about broader impact, and then we will come back to our current fellows, Ian and John and Haley, once Haley jumps on, and have them talk about their writing process, their broader impact, and then the benefits of being a fellow, and how it has changed their graduate career. So Kristen, take it over. We'll let you talk about broader impact for a little bit.
Absolutely. All right. So hi, I'm here to talk to you about broader impacts. My technical title is the Director of Office of Postdoctoral Scholars. The reason that I'm here presenting to you today is mostly due to my previous experience with my previous position at the University of Pennsylvania, where I did a lot of advising on NSF GRFPs, and it was my favorite part of the job there. And I was very excited to be able to bring that skill set here to UB and continue to assist in that way. So as you've been learning the past couple of days about the NSF GRFP sort of call for proposals and what the parts of the application, what that might look like, I'm sure that it's come up frequently that there's this criteria that you're going to be judged against called the broader impacts. And so I'm here to talk about what is that. So first, you could just sort of look at the rules of the program solicitation and what they describe as broader impacts. And I think you'll agree that if you try to read this paragraph, can be a bit of gobbledygook. There's a whole lot of different directions that you can take this in. But the thing that I'd like you to focus in on is what are called societally relevant outcomes. So you are going to be thinking about things that either your research or you sort of as a person are doing to help achieve these societally relevant outcomes. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. What are these SROs or broader impacts, I suppose, as you would say? Outcomes include full participation of women, persons with disabilities, underrepresented minorities in STEM, improved STEM education or educator development at any level. We'll go into more details in all of these. Increased public scientific literacy and public engagement with science. So I sort of differentiate these two things of sort of the second bullet point there is about classroom experience, so being inside a classroom. And this next one is about informal science education environments. So your museums or camps or other ways in which you can talk to the public, social media that are not classroom based. It's a different skill set. And improved well-beings of individuals in society. They're very careful at NSF to use the term well-being as opposed to health because the NIH exists. So they want to differentiate themselves in what they fund from health, and that this is more toward well-being. And then these last few, development of a diverse and globally competitive STEM workforce. That's something that you'll be worried about if you become a faculty member and are writing a different kind of grant. I'm not sure that you can necessarily say that part of your fellowship is something that you're doing. Increased partnerships between academia, industry, and others, improved national security, increased economic competitiveness of the United States, and enhanced infrastructure or research education. So you are probably going to be talking about things that are in this box. It's possible you will talk about other things that are not in the box, but most people that I have advised on NSF GRFPs end up focusing on mostly these 4 things here. And so when I describe these outcomes, many graduate students look at it and say, that is not why I came to graduate school, right? It's not why you're earning a PhD in a research science. So why is this a requirement as a part of this fellowship? So NSF has a particular mission and goals to meet, and they're funded using taxpayer money. They are not just sort of the cash cow that scientists come to and say, please give me money. They have a reason and a purpose for what it is that they're trying to fund. So planning for and reporting on these broader impacts criterion helps NSF ensure that they're funding people and projects that align with those mission and goals. And they want to remain faithful to that charge of spending the taxpayer money and getting a return on their investment. Oh, sorry. Someone is looking to get admitted and won't let me advance my slides. Why are my slides frozen? Okay, so at the end of the day, the agency wants to be able to point at every dollar of taxpayer money and say, this is how the result of spending this dollar was beneficial in some way to the American taxpayer. So you could look at this in an individual picture of why do I need to do this? And honestly, you can take two reasons, and I say, take what motivates you. I am mostly motivated by what's called the warm fuzzy reason. When people come in, my slides freeze. You can have the warm fuzzy reason, which is that if you get funded, everybody wins, right? This is an opportunity for you to improve science education or acceptance of science as a field, as a way of knowing. And the future of science funding, because all of those people that you're talking about, or at least many of those people that you're really talking about, either grow up to be or are current US voters. And so the future of science funding can be affected by this. But also, if that's not your cup of tea, you can go with the cold prickly reason, which is that funding is tight, and that given the choice between proposals with equally strong science and personal achievement, the one with the stronger impacts component will probably be funded. NSF likes to say all the time that they don't use it as a tiebreaker, and I don't really believe that. I think that it can absolutely be used as a tiebreaker. And you just want to put together an application such that it will fall in your favor if you're in that instance. So where do you include broader impacts in your application process? So you're going to do both broader impacts of the research itself. This is sort of answering the question of, how will knowing the answer to your research question be helpful in what way? And that you can identify that by just basically asking the question of who is going to care? Who cares about this research question? And so you are going to need a slant if you're in the biomed or clinical psych area, and you want to focus on mechanism instead of curing or treating disease. So NSF does not want any proposals that the scientific question seeks to cure or treat a disease. Understanding an underlying mechanism and why that disease is occurring, or how that is manifesting, is something that NSF will fund. And this is generally included in the last few lines of your research statement. So the 2-pager, the last, maybe 4 lines is broader impacts of the research. You can also have the broader impacts of related activities. So these are, how are you using your leadership skills and knowledge and science to benefit others? And most importantly, how have you done this in the past, in the present, and how are you going to do it in the future? So I've seen a lot of applications kind of miss out on one of those things, in particular, how you're going to keep doing this in the future. This is not just a list of past accomplishments that says, now you get the cookie of this fellowship, but also that you're planning to continue this type of work in the future and contribute to NSF's mission while you are an NSF fellow. So this is often a very big portion of or woven throughout your personal statement. And that's really dependent on your writing style. I've seen it as a completely separate statement. I've seen it sort of worked through many sections all at once with sort of a big call out at the end to kind of summarize. And that's just really dependent on your narrative style. I don't think that there's a big preference one way or the other. So first, we're going to go into broader impacts of the research itself. And so how do you kind of start thinking about who cares about my project? You want to think about project-specific stakeholders. So there are people such as researchers outside your field who might be interested in the results of your research. The results of your research may have industrial or environmental applications. If you're in psychology, teachers or early childhood educators could be interested in the results of your research, policymakers, etc. And so you want to talk about who would be interested in it. And you would get bonus points, I mean, literal bonus points, but it would be definitely looked favorably upon if you could come up with a way in which you are going to make sure, it's called a warm handoff, make sure that the people that are interested are going to see your results. It is not enough to say, I will publish in my usual journal and someone will eventually read it and, do with it what it is that should be done with it. You can make an intentional effort. So publishing in journals outside of your normal field, presentations to outside groups or to, big conferences that you wouldn't normally go to, but that are slightly adjacent to what you're doing. Integrating your research topic into the classroom if you're teaching, or partnering with the policy group. So what the reviewers use this for is that placing your own research in the context of the larger picture is a sign of academic maturity and conveys a level of understanding that the reviewers need to identify rising stars. So what are some examples of this? And these are pulled from the NSF website, so they are the shining star examples. So this is an example of, in the early 1970s, the NSF funded research that discovered glycoproteins that act as antifreeze in some Antarctic fish. And so eventually we were able to use this technology to increase freeze tolerance of commercial plants, improve farm fish production in colder climates, extend the shelf life of frozen foods, and improve the preservation of tissues for medical transplantation. So obviously the people that were initially looking at just this glycoprotein in a fish didn't necessarily think of all of the ways that this could be applied, but you're going to try to think of some of similar outside application of your work. And then another one that NSF likes to tout a lot, because Sergey Brin was a NSF GRFP recipient, the founder of Google. So NSF was very instrumental in producing Google that has pervaded all of our lives, and we can't live without. And that's the kind of thing that they're looking for, are these rising stars that are going to really change, how we live. So those are some examples of that. Frozen again. There we go. All right, so we've talked about research impact, broader impacts of the research itself. Now we're going to be talking about broader impacts of the related activities. So again, we're coming back to our box of four ideas here. And generally, if I ask people who are looking to apply for this fellowship and say, did you do any of the 4 things in that box? I have a ton of people. If you're looking at this and going, I haven't done any of these things, you are not alone. There are a ton of people that I've helped write successful fellowships that at first they say, no, I haven't done any of those things, because they really identify with these 4 types of activities as being broader impacts. And I am here. This is a list of things that I have spun and helped people draft into fellowship applications to successfully convey the idea of broader impacts. So it can be things like scouting awards, sorority, fraternity, leadership, and community service. Sports teams are a really big one. So being able to balance your time to be a student athlete is something that you can definitely talk about in this. I've had a video gaming coach, clubs of all kinds. So not just science clubs. If you're interested and you were in an art club or in a literary club, we can talk about that. Church missions, food banks, community gardens, and honestly, your own experiences. If you are a member of an underrepresented minority group or a first-gen college student, a woman in science, LGBTQ+, a military veteran, or a person with a disability, that inherently in itself is not a broader impact, but talking about how you will use your personal experiences, should you choose to share them. Again, not a requirement that you share them, but should you like to share them and connect with others in the future, that is something that you can talk about in your personal statement. So when you talk about your broader impacts of related activities, they really want to know, the reviewers, how did you grow through these experiences? So look at them and think about the skills you developed or the lessons you've learned, the goals you formed because of these experiences, concrete ways in which you'll be pursuing these goals at your institution of choice. So if you haven't chosen a place or have not yet been accepted into your institution of choice, I highly recommend going to that website and identifying some student clubs or ways in which you can get folded into those places, and just pick that institution. It's okay if you get the fellowship and you end up going to another university, it follows you, and that's fine. No one is going to fault you that. They're not going to take the money back. But what they want to see is that you have really clear goals. So sort of saying, wherever I land, I will eventually sign up for a student club that's probably doing something related to this is not a very strong statement, but saying I want to go to the University of Chicago. They have a club that does these things in this school, and that's where I want it. That's what I would like to do in my first year, like just really concrete examples. And a commitment to embracing broader impacts philosophy in your future career in a way that promotes science and the next generation of scientists now that you've chosen science. So you can talk about your previous experiences in your art club or your literary magazine or your campus radio, whatever it was that you're doing in the past that maybe had nothing to do with science, but talk about the lessons that you learned there and like the life philosophies and the goals that you formed through those experiences and how you're now going to apply them in the realm of science. So this tells the reviewer that you're committed to the same work that NSF is committed to and that you're likely to continue to do that work. So an investment in you will equal an investment in NSF's mission and goals. That's what you're trying to convince the reviewer. So also this how do you grow question is pretty unique to the NSF GRFP application. Reviewers want fellows that can learn from mistakes and overcome challenges. They don't want to invest in an early year graduate student who maybe has had like a really easy time in the lab and, you know, got some publications because they happen to hit the right time. They know that graduate school is tough and you're going to hit up against some barriers. And so being able to talk about ways that you know, persevered through barriers can be really helpful. That said, your research advisors are very used to cutting this information out of their regular NSF grants and papers because it's a little too personal. So you may get that feedback from someone and it's up to you to make that decision about what is too personal and not. Generally, I say if there is a questionable semester of grades or a project that did not yield exciting results, that's okay. But you should point it out and explain what you've learned and how you'll ensure that this doesn't repeat in the future. So reviewers use this to assess for self-awareness, reflection, and goal setting, which are all characteristics of mature, successful academics who are likely to show resilience through the grad school process. So this showing that an investment in you is likely to yield a return. So now that you're in graduate school and committing to science, what problem does it make sense to apply your skill set to? So now that you've had these experiences, I really encourage you to go back and look through your CV and look at the different experiences that you've had, maybe in those broader categories, and kind of think about what does it make sense. You know, I happened to go to a women's college and I had an experience, you know, working with women in STEM, high school students in STEM. So I would probably write a pretty convincing paragraph about women in STEM and how I would continue in that field. You may have other experiences that it would make more sense to write a different sort of paragraph. Not everyone is going to be able to write about every single one of these things. So some examples of here at UB of what you could potentially become involved with for full participation of underrepresented minorities. There are many professional societies and clubs on campus. There are commitments to do targeted recruitment to fill lab positions rather than just sort of doing a broad call. There are some living learning communities here on campus that can use mentors that are in graduate school. So these are a couple examples. And there are programs that take UB students into K-12 classrooms in the Buffalo schools. Similarly, you can use your own experiences to talk about how you would connect with similar students and ways of giving back if that's something that you would like to share and like to talk about during your statement. This is by no means a requirement. Improved STEM education and educator development. So classroom-based learning programs for reaching out to K-12 schools, summer programs on campus. There are science fairs happening all over the place and everyone's always looking for a professional scientist to come talk to the kids about how to make a science fair project and to judge a science fair. I mean, how excited are kids if a real scientist is coming to judge the science fair and not just their parents? Programs that reach teachers. There are research experience for teacher programs, RET programs on campus, professional development programs, particularly in biology. These tend to be really popular. And cultural institutions and museums also tend to host teacher professional development. So maybe if like kids aren't really your style and you're not really wanting to get in there with the third graders, maybe you look for something where you're teaching teachers, right? Because that's a really great way to increase your impact because every single one of those teachers has a class of 30 kids, right? And you teach the adults. And then there's also programs for reaching out to undergraduates, so mentoring students in the lab during the academic year or the summer months. Increased public literacy. So that is sort of talking about non-classroom informal science education experiences. There's a whole host of institutions. This is just a tiny list of them. And then also I include in this things like blogs, social media, websites. There's a program called Skype a Scientist, which is pretty cool. But I caution with blogs, social media, and websites that you should probably already be doing this before you submit your application, as opposed to saying, I will start a website and people will read it, right? Because that's the big problem there, is that yes, you could start it, but the internet is a really big place. And how are you going to maintain it and make sure that people are actually accessing what it is that you're putting out there, has become a larger question. So if you already have followers and people that are interested in your content, absolutely use that. But if this is new space, then I would say, you know, work on that and get that established first, and maybe that gets included in the next fellowship or grant. And then this improved well-being of individuals in society. I find that this relates most to psychology students. So through mechanistic studies, you can propose that informing the public of how the brain works in both a typical and atypical state can help reduce stigma for those expressing atypical traits. So that's kind of how I've seen well-being used. There's certainly, I'm sure there are other interpretations in other ways, but that's been the most popular one in my experience with this particular fellowship application. It is okay to be a clinical psych student and apply for this. I've also seen it in some engineering projects of if there's a reduction in waste and that resulting in an environmental impact, that can improve well-being, right, of individuals. You know, improving air quality or water quality will improve. And then there's also a group called 500 Buffalo Women Scientists that run a few groups, sort of regular meetings about policy, just sort of chatting about policy and getting involved with that too. So that's something you could look into. So an example, a couple of examples of this kind of work, this sort of related activities. This is an NSF funded project, I believe, out of MIT. What developed basically a visual computer programming language. So rather than inputting code, it makes it much friendlier to the beginner, particularly children, that they can put together graphic components that then program and spit out something. So they're sort of understanding computer programming, but at an easier skill set before learning the language. And then this is someone that I just generally, she has nothing to do with UB. She's just my broader impact sort of, I don't know, she's an all-star. I think what she does is fantastic. Her name is Nalini Nedkarni. She's out in Utah. If you have time or interested to go check out her work, she does some really great stuff. She's a tree canopy ecologist. So she's studying, you know, biology that happens up in the trees. But her broader impacts work is mostly in prisons. And she's done a variety of projects, such as teaching inmates how to grow, sustainably grow mosses that are used in the floral industry so that they're not being poached from the natural forests. And that also offers a skill set for once they've served their time. And then she's also done some other really cool projects of bringing nature imagery just into the prisons in general, and seeing a general reduction in instances of violence and sort of increased well-being of those individuals. So it's just some really cool work. Right, and then this is my final slide. Other resources are up there, and there's me. I am happy to look over applications and offer feedback. And you know, I am working with fellowships and scholarships as to how that process will happen. But I mean, honestly, I'm just a friendly person. So if you want to reach out to me, I'm happy to chat. And I'll take questions. Let's stop. I guess I'll leave that up there. Anybody? No, it's hard on Zoom because
So if you have questions about what is broader impact and what you've done already that might constitute broader impact, I'm sure a conversation with Dr. Ashare and H will help you flesh that out of your resume. Maybe even it's not even on your resume, but it's very significant. So broader impact is unique to each of you, and having a conversation with with H or Dr. Ashare or Dr. Ford Versa will help you put that in place so that you can write a strong proposal.
Yeah, I'm gonna stop sharing.
Thanks. All righty.
Oh, I see a question in the chat. How do you suggest narrowing down which experiences to include in your personal statement? So I have in the past, and we can chat about this offline as well. This is easier for me to do when we're not via Zoom. But I've run a couple workshops where you can break up your CV and kind of start, you take your CV, imagine it, and you have a packet of Post-it notes. And you write one thing from your CV on each Post-it note. And then you can start grouping those activities together. Sort of what my suggestion is. And you can kind of think about what are those categories of broader impacts, and you can take a Post-it note and put it, here's women in science, here's teachers, here's, influencing the future. And as you start to see like instances of your various volunteer experiences or other, it could be classes, if you had some sort of class that was related to it, it generally starts to kind of rise to the top as to what makes the most sense and like what you have the most material to write about. But honestly, there's also probably benefit in writing out about any of them and kind of seeing what naturally rises to the top as being the most interesting narrative. I can't tell you in advance if it's going to be a good paragraph or not until I see the paragraph, and then I'm happy to read it and tell you if it fits or not. Yeah, when you write your first draft, don't worry about how long it is. Just write. It's way easier to cut.
Having some good conversations with H, I think, will help you flesh that out.
Yeah, and just to second what Kristen said, writing more and not really worrying at the beginning what's going to fit and what's not can be really useful, because then when you discuss it with one of us, or even if you talk through what you're planning to write with a friend, we're going to pick up on things or sort of notice some details or connections that you might not automatically be seeing. So it's really, really useful to just generate a lot of material and then talk it through with somebody and start to develop those connections and think about which of these do I want to prioritize, which of these maybe is going to be like a summary sentence somewhere in there just to kind of cover some other bases. So we can definitely work on some of those strategies once you've generated some materials.
Thank you for that question.
Any other questions for Dr. Ashare? Alrighty, well, now I'm going to ask our two guests, Ian and John, to do a brief introduction and tell us a little bit about your undergraduate experience at UB and what your broader impacts were that you wrote about, and what your research is like and where you ended up. And I'll ask some follow-up questions. So Ian, you want to go first?
Sure. So actually, while you were presenting, I pulled up my application and the feedback I got back from NSF. So I'll dive into that a little bit and hit the highlights there. So about me, so I did 4 years undergrad at UB in the aerospace engineering department. I worked in 2 different research labs and wound up going to grad school. In my broader impacts section, I wrote about, I quickly touched on the research, but that the societal impacts of the research were probably the thing they cared the least about based on the feedback. As part of the research groups, we went to some of these events where the engineering school would bring in high schoolers and do like activities with them. And so I mentioned that as well. And then the thing that, based on the feedback, that stuck out the most to them was I talked a lot about, well, I guess maybe I should mention. So the research I proposed was taking data from existing experiments and high fidelity simulations of a certain type of engineering device and creating reduced order modeling of it, and both publishing those models in journals, but also thoroughly open sourcing those models and distributing them to the community. And that's important because if someone else wanted to pick it up, they could just go download it, and start working on it. And it takes a little bit of extra work to do that. And so I mentioned, I called out specifically doing that in the broader impacts on the research statement. Do they still separate okay, yeah. So in the research statement, I talked specifically about that, and every single one of the reviewers spoke favorably of that and didn't mention any of the other things. So I don't know if it makes sense in your research plan to talk about open sourcing whatever you're doing, but doing something a little extra to make your research usable by other people is probably something they're looking for, and that was the strength of mine.
How about your broader impact in your personal statement, past research, future goals? What were the things that you did as an undergrad that you incorporated into that section?
Sure, yeah. So there's a pair. So in high school, rather, I was in Science Olympiad, and then during college, I then helped out with the Science Olympiad events the last 2 years of undergrad. And so there's a paragraph on that. There's a paragraph on a research lab and leadership within the research lab. And then there's a paragraph on the workshops and summer, the things I mentioned before, going when they brought in high schoolers, and doing activities with them. So there's a paragraph on those three things. And then future goals. So I actually wrote in going to Stanford with a specific advisor, and that's not what I did. So I'm at the University of Maryland now. But so I guess that goes to show that it does carry with you, so you don't have to think about it too hard. But there was, and the person at Stanford I had submitted a journal paper with at the time. And so I was calling out specifically working in that lab on a continuation of some of the research that we were currently publishing. And I think that's every paragraph in the PDF I'm looking at. So
Thanks. John, you want to tell us your story? And then I'm going to circle back and ask Ian more questions. So tell us about you, John.
Sure. Can you guys see? Oh, sorry, my bad. I thought it was me.
Oh, no, John.
Okay, my bad. All right.
Sorry, John. Yeah, so similar to you all, went to UB as an undergrad, originally from upstate New York, so familiar enough with the area. But so in undergrad, I kind of had these two, like what I thought to be potentially clashing paths. So I was really interested in art. I did a studio art minor. I did a lot of art in high school, and then I was also still really interested in engineering. And you might think, oh, well, how would art intersect at all with, the NSF or anything like that? But I found that, not only that, I also had a lot of different experiences with research. I wanted to take undergrad as an opportunity to explore a few different paths and a few different things. And they all eventually led me to where I am now, but it's tough to put that in a coherent statement. When you look at your little Post-it notes, they might seem like they're not at all intertwined and linked. And that's probably one of the things I struggled with the most, is sort of linking that research path. But to give you some history, I originally came in as a biomedical engineer. I thought I was going to become a doctor. I was doing pre-med stuff. And then I decided that wasn't for me. And then eventually I shifted more toward designing and building things. So I shifted toward mechanical engineering, which is what I ended up studying. But I still really liked the sort of perspective building that art and other humanities had. So I wanted to incorporate that. And that sort of ended up coalescing me into being really interested in humanitarian engineering and engineering for global development. So right now, to give you a picture where I am now, I'm working on water treatment systems for humanitarian emergencies. And all this to say, at UB, there's, so I did biomedical engineering. I did some work in mechanical engineering, some research on drones, some research in design theory and methodology. And then in terms of broader impact, I did a lot of teaching on the side, and this sort of led me to realize I wanted to be a professor, which is why I'm doing a PhD. These little pieces that kind of seem really scattered, I think it was tough to connect, but once I kind of connected them to what I wanted to do, that's where everything became really clear. And that was sort of difficult for me to do, especially with all of these varied experiences. But I can hopefully help provide, if you need to talk to anyone, I can provide an example of coalescing all of these really varied things. So I would say in terms of broader impact, it was a lot of teaching. I did some of the alternative spring breaks. I led a few of those as well. I did some of the Buffalo public school teaching, and I really enjoyed that. I also taught honors colloquium, if any of you took that. I really enjoyed that one as well, because you had the freedom to craft your own lesson plans. And at the time, Jess Seabury was advising it. You had the freedom to craft these different things, and I really enjoyed that. So all that to say, this ended up coalescing and leading to this where I'm at right now. Yeah.
Great. If you wouldn't mind talking a little bit about your writing process, the process of going through the actual application.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So it seems very daunting at first, for sure. But I think definitely breaking it down into those sections is very helpful. Breaking it down into your intellectual merit and understanding what, research you've done, research contributions you've had, having that pile of Post-it notes there and trying to come up, like mine was chronological. Yours does not necessarily have to be that way, but I found it useful for my narrative. So I did okay, I started off in biomedical engineering and I did this, and then I learned this. And this was the impact that had. And then I went on to another thing, and then another thing that was very impactful to me. I did some research in India and water quality. That was also one of the factors that pushed me to the field I'm in right now. So it's almost a few small stories, but also showcasing kind of the skills and things that you've done. That's how I structured the intellectual merit portion. Was kind of doing that chronologically, and then showing the impact it had on the community, the impact it had on myself, the academic community and the broader community, but mostly the academic community, the impact it had on myself and the direction I took. And then with the broader impact section, I had a different approach. I talked a lot more about my teaching, and I really framed it around that. And then in the end, I kind of coalesced the two and said, hey, these are reasons why I want to be a professor. So it was a lot. So I think the easiest thing for me was to break them down into those two sections, and then and kind of think about what experiences you want to include in each. And then you can kind of begin piecing together the dots and connecting the dots for that narrative. And it can be chronological. It could also be, just a story. Maybe it's a theme, like maybe it's a common theme. And then you have a few examples that are varied throughout time that relate to that theme. There's a few different strategies for that. And, Elizabeth and Kristen, and H and everyone, I'm sure can also help you craft that. But I would say that initial brainstorming process and coalescing them into groups was really helpful for that.
Hey, John, when you were doing your first draft, the strategy I took, and I don't know if this was the best strategy, was I just took bullet points and I turned them into really bad paragraphs, and then I laid them out, and it got better and better with each cut. Was that generally how you approached it as well, or did you find a magic formula?
No, I mean, I think it was something similar. So I had some personal stuff. I was like, all right, I want to include this personal stuff because it's really defined who I am. Mm-hmm. So I started off with some of that, and it was a really big paragraph, but then I cut it down to literally a very, very small paragraph. And yeah, similar thing. You just eventually, once you get your Post-it notes down or you get your bullets down, you should just write a paragraph, just write about the experience, and then you'll start to kind of cut and paste and move things around. As an engineer, for me, it's the process is iterative, right? You're continually changing it. And I'm sure, I think that's the biggest thing is if you feel you're kind of spinning your wheels, you should just start writing, just go, even if it's stream of consciousness or something, just start writing and then go from there and just keep going from there. And one thing I will say, one of the biggest things I recommend is, sometimes I'm self-conscious about my writing, but it's really important to get feedback from other people and varied perspectives. So I asked maybe 5 different people. I asked maybe, I asked Elizabeth, I talked to Meg, I talked to, some of my friends and peers, and I talked to some of my professors about what to include. And they were extremely helpful. And I would say, just getting those drafts and iterating upon those and really making sure you have the time to just go through and keep doing that, that'll really help the process, and it'll kind of alleviate some of that stress and some of the, staring at a blank page and not knowing what to say. I think that's really helpful. It's just continually getting feedback.
Yeah, and I'll echo that. I had professors whose labs I was working in read it, and they did a really thorough markup of it. And there was, like, in the research statement, the research idea, the first cut of it, I would say, was not sensible. It's the type of thing where you write something, someone says, oh, that doesn't make sense, and then you go, oh well, really, okay, so, and then it iterates based on that. And I felt very self-conscious throughout the whole process, but I think that's how it's done for a lot of people, so it's it's okay to feel like that.
I guess I want to ask the next question. What has been the benefit of having the NSF GRFP fellowship played in your graduate career? How has it changed your graduate studies? Go ahead, Ian. I'll have you go first.
Okay. It's the greatest thing ever. You should definitely, if you don't get it, what happens is you go to grad school and then your advisor makes you apply for it. So it makes a lot of sense to just try to get it originally. And then once you have it, what I found is that people tend to just kind of let me pursue my own ideas, which has been, I feel like I've developed a lot as a scientist based on being able to try out something, see if it works or not. And if you're on, the distinction is if you're on a grant that your advisor has, for example, the guy who sits behind there, he has to meet with the PI once a week, and he has to, but the PI, it's a grant from the Air Force. And so they have to meet with the Air Force program manager every week, and they have to show results. And so you're under the gun a lot more to produce. And sometimes that means you have to, go in a research direction that produces short-term results that, maybe it's not what you actually wanted to work on. And so it's tremendous from that perspective.
Are you using your fellowship every year? Because it's 3 years of funding over 5. And
Yeah.
what guarantees or what matching did your university give you?
That's a good question. Yeah. So Maryland gave me a secondary fellowship on top of NSF, and I suspect NSF was part of the reason they were able to do that. So they basically gave me half of what NSF was on top of the existing NSF for 4 years. So that was a big benefit. In terms of how am I spending it? So I guess I didn't have to make that decision because I ended up taking CSGF. So I didn't mention this when I was talking about it, but I actually applied for 3 fellowships and I got 2 of them. And the other one I got is the Department of Energy Computational Science Graduate Fellowship, it's a lot like NSF with a couple other things. And I ended up taking that in lieu of NSF because you can only take one. And so the benefit there is it's 4 years and it's fixed 4 years. It's not 3 years over 5. When I got an offer from other places as well as Maryland, they offered me an internal fellowship in the contingency where NSF or whatever wasn't renewed for 4 years. I think that's all the details. I don't know, John, was that the situation with you?
Yeah, pretty much same thing. So like intellectual freedom, biggest thing I would say is intellectual freedom. It also gives you a lot of stature. So when you're looking at universities and you're kind of trying to apply and get in, I mean, I got the news a little like right around when you're kind of finalizing your decision, like that March 15th decision for grad school. I got the news like right around then. And that really helped me in that last, few weeks kind of push to, be in the research group that I wanted to be in, maybe work with a PI. Because when you come in with your own funding, it's a real big incentive for advisors. So if you have a particular advisor that you want to work with and a group that you want to work with, they may not always have funding. So if you come in with your own funding, at MIT it was like a discount because a lot of, it's really expensive here. It's pretty wild, but they still cover the shortfall. If there's a shortfall at all with the NSF, they'll cover it or vice versa, I'm sure. But yeah, basically intellectual freedom and a lot more flexibility, the flexibility to work on what you want, the flexibility to work with who you want. And also it's a really great award for, for your CV and everything else and pushing new opportunities. It really, it gives you kind of like a Chinese star, for pushing forth other opportunities and getting connected to other opportunities and people. So it's a really great thing.
Any pieces of advice you might want to give to the folks on the call about applying to grad school, applying for fellowships?
Cast
I could start with, sorry.
You can go ahead, John.
Sure. Yeah, I could start with the grad school stuff. So I would say one big thing with the grad school stuff is definitely find the right, everyone always says is find the right advisor, but make sure you talk to a ton of people so that you find kind of the right advisor. I think the advisor ends up sort of determining which school you go to in the end. It's really, you might look at schools and say, okay, hey, here's a cluster of schools that I'm interested in. And then within each of these, you see like maybe a group of advisors or people that are working on similar work. I would say the biggest advice I would have is reach out to these people early. If you can go and visit, what I did is, I was in Boston for a weekend and I reached out to some professors that were out here at MIT, at Harvard, and and I ended up like having some meetings with them. And I was like, hey, I'm in town, would you like to meet, or can we meet? I'd love to talk about your research. I'm a prospective student, et cetera. And, a lot of times, even that can help you get like a foot in the door, because sometimes professors can be more or less responsive, depending on where you're looking and where you're at. So I would say reaching out and then reaching out to the students if they don't respond. That's a big thing too. Reach out to the grad students because they, they'll be extremely helpful, or other people within the lab. Emailing and just getting a list of emails, getting an Excel sheet, and just kind of just telling them you're interested and telling them you want to have a conversation. That goes a long way, I think, in the application recognition and acceptance process, and also for you finding the right fit. It's really important. So I think that was, at least for me, one of the biggest parts of applying is kind of doing that groundwork. That's not always stated, but something I think is really helpful and really good, useful.
Yeah, something I would add on to that is, and this stems from, if I could go back and redo it all, I would do a couple things different. And one of the things I would do, so what I did is I picked a very niche research area, and I found all 8 people who do it in the United States, and I applied to their labs. And that is a approach, but you should just be realistic about that approach, because it is, if something's very niche, there's going to be fewer opportunities available. So when you're looking for advisors and things like that, figure out like a general direction you want to work in, but keep your mind open to working things adjacent to that, because when professors ask, oh, would you be interested in this or that, what they're saying is, I have funding for that, yes or no. And so make sure your net of interests is, sufficiently wide. And one of the reasons I say this is the place I'm at now. Originally, the lab I'm in, I didn't, like, as a first pass, it did not register on my radar. And then, through like an inquiry about, I think, ACT scores or something with the department head, or not. It was something very unrelated. They said, hey, how about this? Talk to this person, and that's how that happened. So try to talk to people, because that's how it's, that's how you'll make those connections that will get you into places.
Great. So I'd like to open it up for questions. I'm sure some of our folks on the call might like to ask John or Ian questions about applying for NSF GRFP, the benefits, grad school. I know there's probably some grad students on the call too. So any questions?
We don't bite.
They've been in your
I can-
shoes.
Yeah, and I can add something to Ian's statement too. I would say, like, again, with the breadth of what you're interested in, I think that's really important, because in the end, like, at least in my experience, I think sometimes arguably even the advisor is more important than the actual work you're doing, because you might have similar skill sets. You can figure out how to do the things you want, but that really matters a lot. Like, you wouldn't believe how people you'll hear them say, oh yeah, it's important, your advisor match, but it's like really, really important. It basically determines mostly whether or not you'll have like a good time or not. So just really making sure you have that fit. And then like Ian was saying, just talking to people. One trick to do with anything, I think, when you have these conversations with people that are out of maybe your circle, is to say, oh yeah, at the end of the conversation, say, hey, knowing what you know about me, do you know anyone else, maybe a couple people that you could connect me to that I might be interested in talking to, or that might have something there. So I think that's also really useful when you're in the kind of PI search, because they get to know you a little bit, and you have some interests, and then you can connect to other people through them, and then that can cascade into more and more people, and your network can grow very wide very quickly. So I think that's a useful thing.
Yeah, I'll echo that. I went to it was like a graduate school fair. It was at Purdue. It was called the Big Ten something. And I mentioned some of the things I was working on and interested in. And there was a word that I said, and the department head I think Michigan or Purdue, that like their head lit up and they said, oh, you should talk to blah, blah, blah. And anyways, yeah. Oh, one more thing about grad schools, actually. So check their website for external fellowships, or sorry, the deadlines for internal fellowships versus graduate deadlines. Because there's some schools where I think they do this because they want to reduce the number of applicants, but they set the deadline for like an internal fellowship like 2 months ahead of the deadline for applications. And so you'll get into a scenario where it'll be like, well, I can go here, but I missed that deadline. So, I didn't end up getting GRFP, and suddenly the option is it's an unfunded offer to go here, and that makes no sense to do. So be very proactive about checking those deadlines.
All righty, well, I'm going to say thank you to everyone. Thank you to Dr. Ashare. Thanks, Ian and John. It's so good to see you and to hear about your graduate school experience. To everyone on the call, start writing, get connected with H. You can do it. And hopefully by having John and Ian here today, shows you that UB students do win. And I definitely want you all to think positively about the process. It's a high stakes application, but you can only learn by doing. So either you learn and you get feedback so you can do it again, or if you learn and if you apply and you don't win it, it's a valuable skill that you're going to use forever in whatever career path that you take. So get out there and do it, and use the support of the Office of Fellowships and Scholarships and everybody else that has raised their hand. So